All right. Well, it's great to be back at BYU. I always love coming back. About 10 years ago, I was in your seat. I sat in the same room many times, listened to the same class, was inspired by many great entrepreneurs, and so it's fun to be back here. One of my very first memories was as a 4-year-old, and my family had just left the United States and moved to the Dominican Republic. And I didn't know at the time, but that was going to change the rest of my life. I ended up spending all of my childhood and early teenage years living in Latin America. And then as an adult, I've spent 6 years living abroad as well. So it was a big impact on my life. But this experience, this first memory I had was looking out the window of the car as we drove to our first home. And as I looked out this car window, I saw children my age, 4 or 5 years old, standing on the sides of the street completely naked. And it was shocking to me to see this. Even as a 4-year-old, I knew that when you go outside, you're supposed to put your clothes on. So I knew something wasn't right. And it's interesting because unlike a lot of things in life that you kind of get used to, this is something you never get used to. It's never something that feels normal, seeing that kind of poverty. And so as I grew up, I felt this calling to do something to help people, to give back. And it was something that I told my parents about. When I got older, I wanted to find a way to help people. And so I looked for ways to do that. And I served my mission in Bolivia, down in the heart of South America. Speaking Spanish, it's one of the poorest countries in the world, the second poorest in the Western Hemisphere. And so I came back really surprised by, I remember driving down my street coming home from the airport and just feeling so emotional, just overcome by emotion, just feeling like I was so unworthy of living here, going back to my home. It just felt like we had so much and these great people that I'd served for so long had so little. And so I started looking for ways that I could make an impact. And when I was at BYU, within the first year of being back from a mission, I read an article in the church news. And it was an article about a man named Steve Gibson. And in this article, it talked about how he had been a professor for a short time at BYU teaching entrepreneurship. But what was really interesting about him was that he was a successful entrepreneur. He had sold his business, and he and his wife had moved down to the Philippines, and they bought a large colonial mansion, and instead of moving into it themselves, they went and moved into a small little apartment, and they started housing poor Filipino returned missionaries in this large home. And for 60 days, these people with 2 months, they'd stay in this in-residence program, and Steve Gibson and his wife would teach them how to start their own businesses. And I was completely inspired. This man was, and it wasn't because he was a successful entrepreneur, because he was a millionaire. It was because he had found his passion in life and found a way to make people's lives better by using that skill and that passion. So I cut out that article and I put it in the front cover of my binder for school. I had a clear-faced binder, and so I stuck it in the front of that binder, and I ended up walking around with that article in this binder for the rest of my time at BYU, for about 3 years. And I kept it there because it inspired me, and I wanted to remind myself why I was here, what was important in life. So I graduated from BYU, and within a couple months, I was back on campus for a social impact conference. I had read about it, I thought it was going to be incredible, so I came to it. And as I was walking down the hallway, I saw Steve Gibson. I'd never seen him before in real life, but I recognized him, and he was getting into an elevator. And I just ran as fast as I could to the elevator, stopped it from closing, and ran inside. And I knew he couldn't escape. He was mine. So I had 30 seconds to basically get to know Steve Gibson. And you have to keep in mind, Steve Gibson, he's a multimillionaire. He's changed hundreds and thousands of people's lives in the developing world. He's an amazing person. I'm a nobody, and I'm just a kid right out of school, and he's acting so flattered that I even know who he is. And it blew me away. I just really admired him more than I ever did before, just seeing how humble he was. And he asked me if I'd be interested in meeting him in his office in a couple weeks. And so I was like, absolutely, I'll totally take him up on that. So for 2 weeks, I prepared a pitch where I wanted to convince him to let me help him expand his program to Latin America, where I'd grown up as a kid. And so I put together this pitch, and I'm pitching this to him. And I could tell he liked what I was saying, but something wasn't connecting. By the end, he tells me, Davis, I love that you're so passionate about this, but if you really want to change the world and you really want to make a difference in the world, you need to become an entrepreneur. And then you can come back 10 or 20 years down the road when you have experience leading and growing things, and you can have the financial resources to make an impact. That's what you need to do. And so I left his office determined that I was going to start my own business. So within a couple months, I'd come up with an idea that I was pretty sure was going to work. And the idea was that I was going to start a business selling pool tables. Totally random. I knew nothing about pool. In fact, under the felt of a pool table is slate. It's like a hard stone. Anyone that knows anything about pool tables knows that. I didn't even know that. So that's how little I knew about the space. But I believed that I could do something disruptive. I believed that I could take a business that was traditionally offline. If you needed to buy a pool table, you'd go to a little retail store and buy it, a little mom and pop store usually. And I thought if I could go build my own brand of pool tables in Asia, in China, I could import them, I could sell them online, and I could cut out this middleman. And I wouldn't have to buy them from Brunswick or someone else. I'd just have them myself, make them myself. And so I ended up starting this business. I flew out to China. I'd never been there before, but within a couple weeks having this idea, I'd done some Google searches, found some factories, flew out there and started visiting these factories, and I listed my first pool table on eBay. And it was amazing, the feeling that I had as we sold the first pool table on eBay. It was like, we just watched as time got closer and closer, at first it looked like we weren't going to sell it because you had to reach a certain amount. And, but as it got closer and closer, it started climbing and climbing. And we knew we had to sell for around $1,500 to make any money. And it surpassed the number. It was it sold for $1,864. And so my cousin and I, that we were doing this together, we started high-fiving each other. We were dancing around the room, and we just couldn't believe that we discovered our first business. So we ended up starting to sell all these tables online, and pretty soon we had people calling us up saying, hey, I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah. I noticed your location is in Salt Lake. Can I come to your showroom? And we didn't have a showroom. We were basically bringing these tables into a warehouse in Salt Lake. They were all in boxes, and then we were shipping them off all over the country. But we didn't actually have a table set up. In fact, we'd never even seen one of our own pool tables set up before. So, but like any good salesman, you never say no. So we told them, of course, yeah, we have a showroom. I'll call you tomorrow, and we'll set up an appointment. So I go to my aunt, and we convince her to let us put a pool table in her basement. And we painted it all night, and we put a little light, and kind of made it look like a little showroom. And then we gave her a cell phone and told her, if anyone calls, just sell them a pool table. And so she started selling pool tables for us every single day. And it was enough validation for us to go open up our first retail store. So we opened our first retail store on State Street in Salt Lake. And a few months later, I moved to Georgia. We opened up a store out in Atlanta. And within our first year, we'd done $1 million in sales. So it was just an incredible start to our business. Over the next 5 or 6 years, we became the largest retailer of pool tables in the U.S. We had physical retail stores around the country and then also sold online. So it was an incredible experience. I found that I discovered I had a love for entrepreneurship. I had a passion for it. And it had nothing to do with pool tables, but it had just had to do with the feeling of growing and starting something on my own. One of my favorite quotes is by Elder Dieter Uchtdorf. And he said, "The desire to create is one of the deepest yearnings of the human soul." And this is true. We are children of the ultimate creator. We're children of God. And inside of us, each of us has this desire to create, to build. And for some of us, it may be music. it may be art. For me, it's building businesses. And there's no greater feeling than taking an idea and building something out of it. So I decided I wanted to keep doing this. And I also knew that I didn't want to be the pool table guy the rest of my life. So I ended up selling the business, and I went to graduate school. And my cousin did the same thing. So we both applied to kind of our dream schools. I always wanted to go to the Wharton School. They have a great program there called the Lauder Institute. And it allows you to do a dual degree where you do an MBA at the Wharton School and you do a master's in international studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And Ivy League education, you get 2 degrees. You have to speak a foreign language at an advanced level. They admit about 60 people to the program, and everyone speaks multiple languages. They've lived all over the world. And so I applied to the program and got in. And I was just stoked. I felt so lucky to have gotten into the program. My cousin applied to business school. He went to Harvard. And so the two of us set off to business school. We sold the business, and we were kind of looking for our next opportunity. And so during that 2 years, we decided to start pursuing ideas together. And so the first year in business school, we started keeping a Google spreadsheet where we kept a running list of ideas. So that first year, we came up with 60 business ideas. And I think this is where a lot of young entrepreneurs make mistakes, where they decide they want to be an entrepreneur, so they start coming up with an idea or two, and they start spending all of their time on that first or second idea. And this is the way you should think about it. If we were going to put together a basketball team, and we needed a center, someone that's really, really tall. If we looked in a very small pool of people, let's say my family, a small group, what's the likelihood of finding a really, really tall person? Not that high. But what if we went to a class this size? Who's the tallest person in the room? Is anyone over 6'3"? Is anyone over 6'4"? 6'5"? 6'6"? 6'7"? 6'8"? 6'9"? 6'10"? Okay, so we got a very tall person. Now we have our center, right? So we had a big pool of ideas. And so this is what you need to do as you start thinking about ideas. You need to be thinking about, how do I come up with as many great ideas as possible? Be very disciplined. Don't spend a bunch of time on an idea that's not great, because you're going to be spending the next 5 or 10 years of your life working on it. So we started coming up with ideas. That first year, we came up with about 60 business ideas. We went out to Silicon Valley, and while we were there, we refined those ideas. We started putting some filters on those ideas. And we took the 60 and we cut it down to 4 ideas pretty quickly. And we knew these 4 ideas were good. And we started testing them, vetting them, experimenting with them. And then by the end of that summer out in Silicon Valley, we knew that we had an incredible idea. And the idea was to go take the experience we had in e-commerce, but to go take it to a new market and in a very large space. So we decided to move down to Brazil. And we launched 2 businesses while we were in Brazil. We launched a business called baby.com.br and a business called jinda.com.br. And baby.com.br is kind of like a company here in the US called diapers.com. Anything you need for a baby is sold there. And then jinda.com.br is a site, it's flash sales. So there's a site in the US called Zulily that's very similar, or if you know Gilt Group or some of these others, where you basically have product on there for like 3 or 5 days, limited quantity, incredibly priced, and stuff moves really quickly. And so we ended up moving down to Brazil and launching this business. And it was a wild ride. We knew that we had to go raise venture capital money. We knew that going and starting this business wasn't the kind of thing where we could just go borrow some money from the bank or something, or from friends and family like we did the first time. And so we decided that we were going to pitch to VCs. And we knew that if we were going to pitch to VCs, they needed to be VCs that understood our space. Otherwise, we'd be wasting our time. So we targeted two different types of investors. Either an investor that had invested in a company called diapers.com. Diapers.com was started by some Wharton guys. I had met them a number of years before, so I knew their story. I knew about their success. And so, and they were, over like 5 or 6 years, they had grown to a humongous company, hundreds of $1 million in revenue. And so I thought, if we can find an investor that had invested in diapers.com, they would likely be interested in this because we could say, hey, it's the exact same model. We're just going to take it to a huge market that doesn't have anything like this. While we were fundraising, Diapers.com sold to Amazon for $540 million. So a huge, great success story for them. The other group of investors we were pitching were investors that had invested heavily in Brazil. So anyone that had invested in Brazil, we figured we could convince them that this idea would work there. So we got an introduction to a guy, an investor in New York City, that had invested heavily in Brazil. And we ended up meeting there. So I went up from Philadelphia, my cousin came down from Boston, and we went into this office, and we had this meeting scheduled. And as we're sitting there waiting to speak to this partner, we can see him through this glass wall. He's in a conference room, and he is on the phone, and he's yelling at someone on the phone, just screaming at this person. And the time for our meeting comes and goes, and it kind of goes 5 or 10 minutes. Finally, this guy gets off the phone and stops yelling at this person and tells us to come into the room to start pitching. And there was no getting to know you. There was no like, hey, where are you guys from, or any courtesy conversation. He just asked us to pitch. So we brought up the PowerPoint presentation. This was really early. We had the idea put together. We had some good, a slide deck that was pretty good, but some holes. We didn't really have a name for the business yet. And we kind of thought a little bit about what the business should be named. And there's a company in the US called Diapers.com, which I mentioned. So we thought, hey, we should just do something similar. There's a word in Portuguese called fraldas. It's diapers. And it's kind of a not great word. It's like, diapers is kind of disgusting. Fraldas even sounds worse. So, but we didn't know that because we had never lived in Brazil. So we actually had this domain, fraldas.com. So we put it up on the slide deck. It was the first slide of this deck. And this investor immediately is just like, what's that? And we're like, well, that's the name of our business, fraldas.com. And he's like, well, why? And we're like, well, fraldas means diapers. He's like, well, I know what fraldas means, but why did you choose that name? And we're like, oh, well, diapers.com, we thought it would work. And he's like, well, don't you realize that in Brazil, everything is .com.br? And we're like, oh, of course we know that. This is just a placeholder. We didn't tell him that we'd spent $6,000 buying the domain like last week. So it's like, oh, geez, we're the biggest idiots. We're just looking at each other just like, oh my gosh, we're such morons. I can't believe we did this. And so, that was just the beginning of a pretty awful meeting. Halfway through the pitch, he answered the phone and yelled at someone else for a few minutes. And, we ended up spending an hour and a half in this meeting with him. And we left totally depressed. I mean, just kind of talking about geez, this guy totally hated us. And as we started talking more, we're like, you know what? Maybe he didn't hate us. A guy like that, he was kind of a jerk. I don't think he'd spend an hour and a half with us if he hated us that bad. So, we're sitting here debating whether he really hated us or not. It's our first VC pitch, so we didn't know what to compare it to. And as we're walking, we look at our phones and we get an email from him, and he's like, I'm in. I want to invest $1 million into your business. And it was just like, what? This is unreal. This is so easy, So we're high-fiving each other, It was just like the day we sold the pool table in the basement. So, it was just a fantastic kind of start to this. But we decided to not take his money. And the reason why was, as we talked, we decided, you know what? What if he called us right now? If we saw his name ringing on our phone right now, would we want to answer? And the answer was no. We would not want to talk to this guy because he's scary. We know what he does on the phone. He yells at people. So we decided that we wouldn't raise money from this guy, but he had validated that we had a great idea. So we started working on the idea more, and we came up with a great domain, baby.com.br. I don't know if I have time to tell this story, but it's a really good one. I have to end at 4:20? Okay, I'm going to tell it because it's really good. Okay, so this domain, we knew we had to have it because we knew it would give a lot of credibility to this business. We'd never lived in Brazil. We didn't have a team there. We couldn't go prove anything because we didn't have a business there. And it was really difficult to set up a business in Brazil. So we thought this domain would create a lot of value and excitement around investors. So I contacted the owner of this domain, baby.com.br. The guy was not using it. It was just basically a blank page, a couple little things, but nothing. He wasn't selling anything. There was no content. And I didn't speak Portuguese. I only spoke Spanish, and I'd taken a Portuguese class at BYU, so I had like a few words. And I kind of just got, he doesn't speak any English, so it was like, it was a mess. I mean, it was like, like kindergartners talking to each other. And, we were starting to communicate, and I asked him more about this domain, and he tells me that he'd bought 70 domains in Brazil in 1999. And in my mind, I'm just thinking, dude, this guy's brilliant, man. He's like minting money. He's bought all these domains, and now they're worth all this money. And, I asked him how many domains he sold up to that point. How many do you guys think he'd sold up to? This is in 2010, so 11 years after he bought them. How many domains do you think he'd sold at that point? 4? Okay, the answer is 0. Okay, he'd sold none. And when he told me that, it was like, okay, this is not good. He must be crazy, because how can you go 11 years without selling a domain? And he's sitting here telling me basically he's not interested, He's like telling me how he gets so many inquiries for this domain all the time that, he's just probably not even really interested in selling. So it was very clear he was just willing to walk away from this deal. And there's 2 ways that you can buy a domain. You can either go with the approach of like, man, I'm a poor student, I have no money. That can work sometimes for some domains. And then there's other domains that are great, like the pooltables.com domain that we acquired, or this baby.com.br domain, where they know they can get top dollar and they're willing to sit on it for years. And so you just need to convince them that you're the best person on the planet that they're ever going to come across, that they'll never sell it for as much as they would to you. And so that's what we had to convince this guy, was that this was the best deal he was ever going to get. And so I started to get some ranges from him, like trying to understand if we could even buy it. And he gave me a range of $500,000 to $1 million to buy the domain name. There's no business. It's just some letters on the internet, right? And this is a lot of money. But we also knew kind of the value of domains because we'd bought the pooltables.com domain. And we kind of estimated the value was maybe $350,000 for the domain. But given that Brazil was so hot, we thought, you know what, we could probably justify paying more. And we felt like we needed this domain to be able to go raise the money that we wanted to raise. And so I make him an offer, and I tell him, look, we'll give you $500,000 for this domain, but I need to pay you over 5 years. So I want you to finance it for us. We'll pay you interest, a low interest rate, and we'll pay you monthly payments. And if we ever miss a payment or make a late payment, you can keep the domain, and you can keep all the money that we ever gave you. That's low risk for us, right? 3 months in, 5 months in, if we realize it's not working, we can stop the payments. We didn't spend $500,000 on a domain. We just spent a few tens of thousands. So I tell him he just needs to let us know by the end of the day, because if he doesn't tell us by the end of the day, we're going to go buy another domain. And so he comes back at the end of the day and says, you know what? I've read over the offer, and I'm in. You can pay me this money. You can pay me over 5 years. But at the end of the 5 years, you need to give me $1 million in cash, or you can give me 10% of your revenues for 10 years. And it was like, oh my gosh, this guy is crazy. Like, he doesn't even understand what he's asking for. So I was so frustrated. But I came back to him and said, hey, help me understand where you're coming from, because this is so far out of the range that we ever discussed. We can't do the deal at this range. In fact, we can't do the deal beyond what we've offered. We're just not going to do the deal beyond that. And he goes on and says, well, look, the reason I'm saying this is because, Brazil is a different place. We have, there's currency risk, there's inflation risk, there's political risk, there's, what if you got the domain and I had to go sue you for it and it took 10 years in court to go get it back? And I started to understand, okay, yeah, it's fair what he's arguing. So I said, okay, so what you're saying is if I gave you $500,000 today, you would do the deal. And he said, yeah. So we said, okay, we're going to do it. This is the way we're going to do it. I'm going to wire you today $5,000. And then all I need is 90 days, and I will give you the balance payment. And what you need to do is just put our logo, baby.com.br, up on that page and say, coming soon. And he said, done. So I sent him this $5,000. He put our logo up on the site and said, coming soon. And then I had 90 days to go sell the tar out of this idea to investors. And that's what we did. So 90 days later, on the day, we closed. We paid him $500,000 for the domain. And we closed on a $4.5 million round of financing from investors. And so we had built, this is what entrepreneurship is all about. It's about, with very little money, finding a way to solve a problem. Finding a way to create value in a business that really is nothing more than an idea. And so we ended up raising a little over $40 million for this business over the next couple of years. Within 18 months, the business was a $100 million business. Just a wild and crazy ride and success story. We ended up bringing on an amazing spokesperson for our brand, a woman named Angelica. I know there's anyone here Brazilian or has lived in Brazil? I know one Brazilian, some people that have lived in Brazil. So Angelica, you probably know. Her and her husband are super famous. Her husband has more Twitter followers than the New York Times, like 15 million Facebook fans. And so this couple is phenomenal. So she became our CMO, our Chief Mommy Officer. And it was just a fantastic experience. So, in a lot of ways, this was a dream come true. I was living in Latin America again, just like I had when I was a kid. My two daughters were speaking Portuguese. I loved it, and I was building a real business. But at the same time, I knew I had to leave. And people didn't understand. They didn't understand. My partner, my investors didn't understand why I wanted to leave. But I knew I had a mission. I knew I had a responsibility to go do something more meaningful. And it came back to my experience with Steve Gibson and that desire that I had to go make a positive impact on the world. And I'm going to show a quick video. Just a story, my wife and I telling a story of an experience that we had when we were students at BYU. And I'll show this really quick. It'll give you an idea of why I wanted to start this business. Hopefully the audio works.
In 2001, my wife and I were newlyweds, and we decided that we wanted to have an adventure together. So we found this unpaid internship in Peru, and we decided to do it together. So we went off to Lima and spent some time there, and then towards the end of this time, we decided to go up to Machu Picchu. So we flew to Cusco, the city close to Machu Picchu. Anyone that's been to Cusco, the first place you go is the main plaza. Right when you walk into the main plaza, there's street children everywhere, and they're always looking to approach you and sell you finger puppets or jewelry or postcards or to shine your shoes. We unexpectedly befriended a little street kid that shine shoes.
He was so desperate to shine and give us the shoes, and so he just stuck out to us.
And I had tennis shoes on, but he was so insistent that he wanted to shine my shoes.
We brought him some extra food, and he was so happy. He shared it, he gathered his friends, and they all ate it together. And from then on, we knew we wanted to look for him every day. After doing something kind like that and seeing that type of reaction, we know that we want to keep doing it.
One of our last nights in Cusco, we were walking back to our hotel. It was around 11:30 at night. We saw two little children huddled on the side of the street.
And I recognized Edgar right away. We had to wake him up, and we were so shocked to see him out that
I
late.
could see on his face that he'd been crying. He told me that his shoe shine had been stolen earlier that day, and he was afraid to go home. It was just a heartbreaking thing to see this poor little kid going through this experience. We gave him a little money that we had. We could tell that he felt better.
The next day, we were leaving on the bus, and we saw him on the steps to the cathedral.
We saw little Edgar running towards the bus window, and we immediately opened up this window, and we could see he was happy, and he had this big bag of candy that he bought that he was selling to make money. And it was just enough time for us to say goodbye to Edgar. As the bus started rolling away, he ran next to the bus and just waved goodbye to us. Like, I've been telling this story since 2001, just telling people about Edgar and this experience that we had.
After that, we knew that at some point in our married life, we wanted to help disadvantaged children in other countries.
Simply because of where they were born geographically in the world, they have incredibly difficult lives. And it doesn't take much to impact them. It's not too late for other children. There are other children like Edgar that we can help in a real way help impact their lives. Cotopaxi is about finding a way that we can sustainably give back to the world.
So that experience impacted me in a way that it's hard to describe. I'd gone to Peru to to see Machu Picchu, but it was actually the experience. It was actually the experience that we had with Edgar that stuck with us. I've thought more about Edgar than I ever have about Machu Picchu. So actually, there's a cool ending, not really ending to the story, but there's a cool addition to the story since this little piece was filmed earlier this year. In fact, the picture and the little video that you saw of Edgar, I didn't even know I had those until this year. I dug them out of a box. I actually didn't even remember what Edgar looked like. But found those pictures, and Steve Gibson called me earlier this year and asked me if I'd go to breakfast with him. And we'd kept in contact, and so he invited me to this breakfast, and he told me he had some exciting news to share. He wanted to invite me to go down to Peru and help teach the inaugural class of this program down in Peru to these return missionaries that wanted to start businesses. And of course, I was thrilled, to be able to go down to Peru. I had never been back since 2001. And while I went and taught that class in Lima, and when I was done, I decided I had to go to Cusco. I had to go to Cusco and look for this boy. And so I went back, and I didn't know his last name. I just knew his first name was Edgar. I knew he'd be about 22 years old. And I went into the main plaza with my phone with a picture, and within minutes, I had a huge crowd, maybe 60 people gathered around me, listening and looking at this picture of this little boy. And it didn't take 10 or 15 minutes before someone in the crowd knew him. And I ended up being able to find Edgar. So this is Edgar today. And he still works in the plaza. He has learned how to paint, and he sells paintings there. The first thing he wanted to do, he watched the video of himself, that 18-second video clip. He watched it probably 20 times. He'd never seen a picture of himself as a child. And he was so excited to show me his house. So we went up to his house. It turns out he was orphaned just a few years after I met him. His mom died giving childbirth. He has a little brother that's 11. And then he has a teenage sister, and he's raising those siblings. And he took me to his house. It was just a mud adobe house with a hole in the ground for a bathroom. Depressing in some ways and completely inspiring in others. And I left so proud of Edgar and what he'd accomplished with the cards he was dealt in life. And I also came away re-inspired to continue on this mission of building something meaningful. So earlier this year, I launched a company called Cotopaxi. We're an outdoor gear brand, but with a social mission. So every piece of gear raises money for a social cause. Like this backpack, for instance, you guys may have seen this pack wandering around campus. We have different colors and stuff. This pack is called the Cusco, and it actually raises money for a little shelter in Cusco, Peru, that helps street children. It's actually the exact shelter that Edgar used to stay at as a child. And I know that because he's the one that took me there and showed me. So every single product has a cause and a story behind it. So when you see that backpack around campus now, you know the story behind it. You know the reason that pack exists. And so every product has its own story. If you buy a water bottle, we give 6 months of clean water to someone in need. So when we launched earlier this year, we knew we had to launch in a big way. We had these amazing products, a really cool brand that we were building around adventure and discovery and humanity. But we knew that no one would know about us unless we did something big. And so we came up with an idea called the Questival. Who here has heard of the Questival? Okay. Did anyone do the Questival? All right. We have a few people that did. All right. So pretty amazing event. We had about 1,400 racers, about 5,000 total people participate. And it was a 24-hour adventure challenge. People that would run around doing all sorts of outdoor activities, doing service, milking mammals, eating street tacos with no hands, taking selfies with llamas. And everything you did you got points for doing, and you would document it through social media. So we had 30,000 social media posts that day. Anyone that did the Questival knows that your friends hated you for about 24 hours. So, but everyone heard about the Questival. They heard about Cotopaxi. There's a cool video, but I'm not going to show it to you. But it's about the Questival. You can watch it on our website if you want. But everyone, we're going to do the Questival again. We just did one in San Francisco last month, and we're going to do 30 of these across the country next year. Did you guys already see this story about this story? Do you guys know this story? I heard that you guys saw it. So I won't retell it because it sounds like a lot of you saw it. But super inspiring story. And for those that missed it, I'll summarize it though. I love adventures. I love reading about adventures. And this group of people that you can see here, they made it to some of the first humans at the South Pole. And they spent months getting there. And this quote is what was written in the journal. This is Captain Robert Falcon Scott. And he wrote in his journal, "The worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place." Why did he say that? Because he got beat there, right? These guys beat him. So when they got there, someone else had already gotten there. And when they were asked, when Roald Amundsen, this great Norwegian, and his crew were asked why they succeeded, they said, "Victory awaits him who has everything in order. Luck, people call it. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. This is called bad luck." Entrepreneurship is about this. It's about preparing for success. It's not about necessarily moving as fast as you can possibly move. You have to plan. You have to think. Just like the story I told you about coming up with Baby. We spent a year coming up with ideas and planning for the success of that business. And so, my challenge to you guys is to find that way, a way to challenge yourself to do something new, to be prepared for that success. This is also one of my favorite quotes. This is from the book Moby Dick. Has anyone read Moby Dick? It's horribly long, but it's a great book. But the quote says, "As for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas." I also love to sail forbidden seas as an entrepreneur. And I hope that each of you can look for ways that you can make a difference in the world. It's easy to go get a job and work for someone else, but my challenge for all of you guys is to be willing to take some risks now. It only gets harder. I already know you're broke. Your cars are all awful. You probably live in a pretty crappy apartment. If things go bad, you're no worse off, okay? 5 or 10 years down the road, it gets much harder. So I started my first business. I had a brand new baby. I actually did have a mortgage, but I really had not very much to lose. So I hope that each of you can look for ways to change the world, to make the world better. Not just with businesses, but that you can serve and give back to the world and do it in a social way as well. So I really appreciate the time here. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm going to be upstairs to answer questions as well. So,